I served 9 years on a Coast Guard buoy tender. One day, 60 miles offshore, we hauled a 20-ton buoy aboard. On its hull, someone had painted a name in fresh white marine paint. Not the buoy's designation, a man's name. The last servicing was 4 years earlier, and the name belonged to a machinery technician on our own cutter. That was my third year aboard the cutter. We were responsible for maintaining nearly 200 offshore aids to navigation across the mid-Atlantic. It was grueling, dangerous work. The buoy in question sat 60 nautical miles from the nearest point of land, in water 300 feet deep, a location no recreational boater ever visits. The paint was still tacky. Our captain documented everything, then ordered it stripped. The technician whose name was on it asked to be relieved of his deck duties, and he wouldn't say why. We all assumed it was a cruel prank, some kind of psychological warfare between crewmates. But 3 weeks later, that technician was gone, lost overboard during a routine night transit in moderate seas. His body was never recovered, and the strange thing is, it wasn't the first time. I didn't know it at the time, but the incident that would change everything started on a routine day in late October, the kind of gray Atlantic morning where the sea and sky bleed into each other with no seam. I had been aboard the cutter for just over 2 years, a junior petty officer working the deck force. Our mission was simple on paper: maintain the offshore aids to navigation that marked the approach lanes for ships coming into the busiest ports on the East Coast. In reality, we lived in a world of rust, heavy steel, and relentless salt spray, operating a floating industrial platform that rarely saw land. That day we were working the southern reaches of our area of responsibility, a chain of deep-water buoys that stood sentinel over shipping channels 60 nautical miles from the nearest coastline. The water beneath us was 300 feet deep, cold enough to kill a man in minutes even in summer. We were alone out there, no other vessels on radar, no aircraft overhead, just the cutter and the endless ocean. Our target was a Type 4 steel navigation buoy, 20 tons of red-painted iron that marked the easternmost edge of the traffic separation scheme. These buoys sit out for years at a time, pounded by storms, encrusted with marine growth, their chains stretched to the breaking point by the constant heave of the sea. Every few years we hauled them aboard, serviced their lights and power systems, repainted them, and put them back on station. It was dangerous, physical work. You learn to trust your crewmates with your life because one wrong move with a 20-ton load swinging off a crane cable could crush a man before he even heard it coming. I was on the recovery team that morning, working the deck alongside our bosun's mate and 4 other deckhands. The crane operator lifted the buoy out of the sea with practiced precision, and as it cleared the water, we saw it was heavily fouled, long ribbons of seaweed draping from the hull. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the paint. Even before the buoy touched the steel deck, I could see something had been added to its side. Right over the official hull marking, the black stenciled letters and numbers that identified this aid as a federal navigation structure, someone had painted something else. White paint, glossy and bright against the weathered red steel, hand-brushed letters running almost the full height of the buoy's neck. We set it down gently and approached. The letters spelled out a name. Not the buoy's designation, not a vessel name, not a port identifier. A man's name, first and last. The paint was still tacky to the touch. Our bosun's mate called for the quarterdeck to notify the captain, and within minutes, the commanding officer was down on the buoy deck himself, digital camera in hand. He ordered us to stand clear while he documented every angle, every brushstroke. The name meant nothing to most of us at first. It wasn't a crew member's name I recognized, and I thought I knew everyone aboard. But as the officer of the deck pulled the crew roster, whispers started spreading from man to man. The name belonged to a machinery technician assigned to the cutter, a man who had been aboard for just over a year, working in the engineering spaces below decks, rarely ever topside. A guy we'd all passed in the passageways, eaten chow within the mess, stood duty with on quiet nights. The captain didn't say anything at first. He just took his photographs and then gave the order to remove the paint before we proceeded with the servicing. But before we could touch a scraper to the steel, the technician himself appeared on deck. Someone had gone below and told him. He walked straight to the buoy, stared at the painted letters, and his face went pale. He asked to be removed from deck status immediately. He wouldn't explain. He just looked at the buoy, then at the captain, and said he needed to speak in private. Whatever was said in that cabin stayed sealed, but when the door opened, the technician was off the deck detail, and the captain was filing an incident report that would disappear into the black hole of Coast Guard administrative records. I watched the paint get scraped off later that afternoon. The buoy went back into the water before sunset, but long after the steel had vanished beneath the waves, I couldn't shake the image of those white letters. The paint was fresh, less than a day old. The buoy had been untouched for 4 years, 60 miles from shore, in 300 feet of water, miles beyond any recreational traffic lane. No small craft could have reached it without being tracked. No helicopter had been reported. No vessel had been in the area for weeks except our own. And somehow a man's name had been painted on it, a name that belonged to a crewman who swore he had never touched that buoy in his life. That night, the technician stopped me in a narrow passageway outside the mess, grabbed my arm with a grip that hurt, and whispered something I will never forget. He said, "I didn't do it, and I think someone on this ship wants me dead." Then he released me and walked away into the dim red glow of the below-decks lighting, leaving me alone with the sound of the engines and the dark Atlantic pressing against the hull. I didn't sleep that night. The passageways of the cutter are narrow enough that you can't pass another person without turning sideways, and every time I heard footsteps outside my rack, I tensed up. I replayed the technician's words over and over. "Someone on this ship wants me dead." It sounded like paranoia, the kind of thing a man says when his mind is cracking under the isolation of a long patrol. But I had seen the buoy. I had touched the paint. That was real. The next morning, I went looking for him. His name was Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb. I found him in the engine room, standing watch over a generator that didn't need watching. He looked like he hadn't slept either, dark circles under his eyes, his coveralls already stained with grease though it wasn't yet 0700. When I walked in, he flinched. I asked him if he was okay. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "You don't believe me. Nobody believes me." I told him I believed he was scared. That was the truth. What I didn't tell him was that I wasn't sure if the threat was real or if his fear was the real danger. Over the next few days, the crew split into 2 camps. Most of the deck force thought someone was playing a sick joke on Webb, maybe a rival from another division, maybe even one of his own engineers. The engineering department closed ranks around him, protective and suspicious. The officers stayed quiet. The captain had submitted his incident report, but no response came back from district headquarters. It was like the whole thing had been swallowed by the sea. Webb started changing his routines. He stopped eating in the mess deck, taking his meals in the engineering workshop instead. He refused to go topside after dark. He asked the executive officer for permission to carry a knife, which was denied. He started sleeping in different spaces, never the same rack 2 nights in a row. I knew all this because I was watching him. We all were. Then came the night of the 23rd. I had the midwatch on the bridge, manning the radar console while the officer of the deck paced the starboard wing. Around 0100, the quarterdeck called up on the internal comms. Someone had reported a disturbance near the aft machinery space. A few minutes later, the engineering duty officer came on the circuit, his voice tight. He said Webb had barricaded himself in the emergency steering compartment and was refusing to come out. The captain was roused. The executive officer went below personally. I stayed on the bridge, listening to the fragments of conversation that filtered up through the chain of command. Webb was shouting, incoherent, something about someone following him, someone who wasn't crew. It took 2 hours to talk him out of that compartment. The next morning, the captain placed him on medical hold, confined to the ship's small sick bay under observation. The official word was extreme fatigue. Unofficially, everyone knew Webb had lost his mind. I visited him once. The corpsman let me in for 5 minutes. Webb was sitting on the edge of the examination table, staring at the bulkhead. I asked him what he saw in the emergency steering compartment. He turned his head slowly, and when his eyes met mine, they were calm. Too calm. He said, "It's not just me. There have been others, I found out, I looked it up. Other tenders, same thing, a name on a buoy and then the man whose name it is goes overboard every time. Nobody talks about it because nobody survives long enough to tell anyone. He paused, then whispered, I saw him, the one who paints them. He was standing at the end of the passageway, and he looked like me. I was told to leave a minute later. Webb was sedated shortly after. That was the last time I spoke to him. 3 weeks after the buoy was hauled aboard, we were transiting north through moderate seas, doing maybe 15 knots under a new moon. The sea state wasn't dangerous, just a steady swell that made the cutter roll with a rhythm you could set your watch to. Webb had been released from sick bay 3 days earlier, deemed fit for light duty. He was assigned to the galley, peeling potatoes and staying in sight of the cooks, a kind of unofficial suicide watch that didn't have that label on paper. At approximately 0200, the ship's alarms went off. Man overboard, starboard side. The crew scrambled to muster stations. Every man accounted for except one. Marcus Webb was gone. The lookout on the starboard bridge wing had seen nothing, heard nothing, just a splash that he initially thought was a wave breaking against the hull. By the time he realized what it was and sounded the alarm, the cutter was already half a mile from the spot. We searched for 19 hours. The Coast Guard launched a full search and rescue operation, helicopters from Air Station Atlantic City, a second cutter diverted from its patrol, a C-130 overhead dropping flares through the night. They found nothing. Not a life jacket, not a boot, not a hair. The water temperature was 52 degrees. In those conditions, survival time is measured in minutes. Marcus Webb was declared lost at sea. The official report listed the cause as unknown, with contributing factors including fatigue and psychological stress. That report was a lie. I knew it. Everyone on that cutter knew it. But knowing something and proving it are two different things in the military. The captain held a memorial service on the flight deck. Webb's personal effects were boxed up and sent to his next of kin. The buoy we had serviced that October day was still out there on station, its red steel hull now clean of any name, blinking its light every 10 seconds for ships that would never know what had happened. I couldn't let it go. After the memorial, I started asking questions, quietly, carefully, with people I trusted. The response was always the same. Nobody wanted to talk about it. The deck crew avoided my eyes. The engineers shut down any conversation that drifted toward Webb. Even the officers, who usually tolerated a certain amount of scuttlebutt, clamped down hard when the topic came up. It was like the whole ship had made a pact to forget. But there was one man who didn't look away when I mentioned Webb. The chief warrant officer. He was the most senior enlisted man aboard, 30 years of service, a walking institution. He had been on buoy tenders since the days when navigation aids still used to settle in lanterns, and you serviced them with nothing but a grappling hook and raw muscle. He had seen things that never made it into official histories. He was also, as everyone knew, a man who kept his own counsel. I approached him one evening on the fantail, while he was smoking a cigarette and staring out at the dark water. I didn't ask a question. I just stood next to him and waited. After a long silence, he said, "You want to know about Webb?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. He took a long drag, the ember glowing orange in the darkness, and then he said it. "We have a name for it in the fleet, unofficial. We call it getting your buoy, and it's happened before." I felt the deck shift under my feet. He looked at me, his face unreadable in the dim light of the fantail floodlights. 4 other tenders that I know of personally. Same pattern. A name painted on a buoy that hasn't been serviced in years. A crewman who swears he didn't do it. A captain who files a report. And then within a month that crewman goes into the water. Sometimes it's ruled suicide, sometimes accident, sometimes they just disappear and the ocean doesn't give them back. He crushed his cigarette under his boot. Nobody reports it up the chain anymore. The first couple times the investigators came aboard, asked questions, found nothing. No evidence of a crime. No suspect, no motive. After a while, the fleet figured out that the only thing reporting does is bring a cloud over the cutter and ruin careers, so we handle it quietly. We watch the man whose name shows up. We try to keep him safe, but it never works. I asked him who was doing it, who was painting the names. He shook his head slowly. Nobody knows. Some say it's a ghost, some say it's a curse, some say it's a man who's been doing it for decades and never been caught. But I'll tell you one thing I've learned in 30 years on this ocean. There are things out here that don't explain themselves to you. And there are men who come to the sea because they know it will keep their secrets. He walked away, leaving me alone with the sound of the wake churning white against the black water. I stood there for a long time, thinking about those 4 other tenders, those 4 other men who had seen their names on a buoy and then seen nothing ever again. I thought about how deep the Atlantic is, how many bodies it has swallowed, how many stories it has silenced. And I realized that whatever had killed Marcus Webb was still out there, still painting, still waiting. The chief warrant officer's words didn't leave me. Getting your buoy, 4 other tenders, 4 other men who saw their names and then saw nothing. I lay awake in my rack that night, listening to the ship breathe around me, the creak of steel, the distant thrum of the engines. I couldn't stop thinking about what kind of thing could paint a name on a buoy 60 miles from shore, leave no trace, and then, weeks later, reach out and pull a man into the sea without anyone seeing it happen. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was a man, a living person, a crewmate with access to small boats and paint. But the other part, the part that had stood watch on dark mid-watch and stared into the absolute black of the open ocean, wasn't so sure. The next port call was Norfolk. I had 48 hours of liberty. Instead of heading to the bars with the rest of the deck crew, I took my laptop to a quiet corner of the base library and started digging. The chief had given me the names of the 4 cutters. I won't repeat them here, because the families of the men who died deserve their privacy, but I can tell you what I found. The first incident was 17 years ago, on a buoy tender out of Portsmouth. A seaman apprentice, 19 years old, fresh out of boot camp. His name appeared on a channel marker 40 miles off the Virginia Capes. The paint was oil-based white, brushed on. He saw it himself when the buoy came aboard, laughed it off as a prank. 2 weeks later, he was found floating face down in the harbor, still wearing his life jacket, which was unbuckled. The second was 11 years ago, on a tender home-ported in Charleston. A bosun's mate, second class, career man, engaged to be married. His name showed up on a sea buoy 80 miles offshore. He didn't find it funny. He requested a transfer the same day. Before the paperwork could clear, he went missing during a swim call. His body was never recovered. The third was 8 years ago, out of Miami. A machinery technician, just like Webb. His name painted on an intracoastal marker, this one only 20 miles out. He lasted 6 days before a piece of deck equipment failed catastrophically. The investigation ruled it an accident, but the crew who were there said the chain that snapped had been inspected that morning and showed no signs of wear. The fourth was 3 years ago. A junior officer, an ensign, on a tender in the Pacific Northwest. Her name appeared on a buoy near the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. She went overboard during a storm. Her body washed ashore 2 weeks later, beaten against the rocks. The autopsy found no evidence of foul play, but one of the investigating officers noted in the file that the victim had been deeply distressed in the days before her death, telling friends that she felt she was being followed. 4 names, 4 deaths, 4 investigations that went nowhere, and now Marcus Webb made 5. I cross-referenced the crews of all 4 cutters looking for any common thread. A transfer list that would put 1 man on every ship at the right time. A pattern of assignments. Nothing. The crews were different, the home ports were different, the years were different. But there was one detail that stopped me cold. In every single case, the buoy that carried the name was one that hadn't been serviced in at least 3 years. 3 to 5 years always, deep water marks, untouchable except by a tender. And in 2 of the cases, the paint was still wet. I printed out everything I could find and stuffed it into my sea bag. That night back on the cutter, I showed the printouts to the one person I trusted more than anyone, my bosun's mate, a grizzled senior chief who had taught me everything I knew about working the deck. I expected him to tell me I was imagining things. Instead, he sat down heavily on a bit, looked at the faces of the dead men and said, "I knew one of them. The second one, Charleston. I was on a different ship, but I heard the rumors. They said his rack was found with the sheets torn off like he'd been pulled out of it, but nobody investigated that. They just said he went swimming alone at night. The senior chief looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Fear. Genuine, deep fear. You need to be careful who you talk to about this, he said. There are people in the fleet who don't want this getting out. I don't know if it's because they're scared or because they're protecting someone or because they just don't want the attention, but I know one thing. Every man who started asking questions like you're asking, they ended up on the list. 2 of them. Their names showed up on buoys the next year. My blood went to ice. I asked him if he was saying that asking questions made you a target. He just nodded. That was the moment I understood the true shape of the thing. It wasn't random. It wasn't a ghost picking names out of the ether. Someone or something was watching. When you started to get close, when you started to believe, you got marked. The buoy was a warning, and the warning was also a sentence. I tried to step back to let it go. For 2 weeks I focused on my duties. I serviced buoys, painted steel, spliced lines, stood my watches. I stopped talking about Webb. I stopped looking at old incident reports. I became, on the surface, the ideal junior petty officer, invisible, compliant, silent. But I couldn't stop thinking, and I started noticing things. There was a certain look that passed between some of the older crewmen when the subject of Webb came up. A knowing glance, then a quick shift of topic. The executive officer seemed to be watching me more than usual. The quarterdeck log from the night Webb disappeared had a 2-hour gap, which the officer of the deck said was a simple error, but the pages before and after were written in different handwriting. Someone had torn out the original entry and replaced it. And then, 6 months into my 4th year aboard, we hauled up a buoy that made every man on deck freeze. It was a routine service, a mid-Atlantic mark we visited every 3 years like clockwork. The crane lifted it out of the sea, dripping, encrusted with barnacles. As it swung inboard, I saw the white letters first. They were on the side facing me as if they had been placed there for me to see. Fresh, glossy, impossible, my name, my full name, first and last. Painted in the same white marine paint, the same careful brushstrokes. The paint was still tacky to the touch. The deck went silent. I could hear the waves slapping the hull, the cry of a gull overhead, the blood pounding in my ears. The bosun's mate looked at me, then at the buoy, then back at me. He didn't say a word. Nobody did. The captain was called. The photographs were taken. The report was filed. And I was standing on the deck, staring at my own name, knowing that in 3 weeks, maybe less, I was going to die. The captain ordered the paint removed just like before. But this time, I didn't let them scrape it off without a fight. I asked for a sample to be taken. I demanded it. The executive officer tried to refuse, but the captain, to his credit, allowed it. A small chip of the white paint was placed in a sterile evidence bag, which I sealed and signed. Then I watched the rest of it get stripped away, the steel underneath clean and unmarked, as if the name had never been there. That night, I called a number I had found in the back of one of the old incident reports. A retired Coast Guard investigator who had worked the first case 17 years ago. His name was Driscoll. He was in his 70s now, living in a small house on the Chesapeake. When I told him who I was and what had happened, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "You have the paint sample." Again, not a question. I said yes. He told me to get it analyzed, and not by any military lab, a civilian forensic chemist. "If it matches the other samples I've seen," he said, "you'll know that what you're dealing with isn't human. Or if it is, it's a human who's been doing this for at least 2 decades without aging, without leaving a single fingerprint, without ever being seen. Either way, you're in more danger than you can possibly imagine." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I called back, but no one answered. I found out later that Driscoll's house had burned down 3 days after that call. The fire department said it was an electrical fault. Driscoll's body was found in the wreckage, but the dental records didn't match. The investigators noted the discrepancy but never followed up. The case was closed. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours until dawn sitting in the mess deck, a cup of cold coffee in my hands, watching the passageways, waiting for a shadow that I knew was coming. Because now I understood. This wasn't a curse. This wasn't random bad luck. This was a hunt. A hunt that had been going on for decades, that spanned the entire Atlantic fleet. that was carried out by someone or something that could reach a buoy 60 miles offshore without leaving a trace, that knew the names of crewmen who asked too many questions, that could paint a warning and then deliver on it with surgical precision. And now my name was on the list. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the mess deck, the cold black ocean beyond, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait to be pulled over the side like the others. I was going to find out who or what was painting those names, even if it cost me my career, even if it cost me my life. The next morning, I requested a meeting with the captain. I told him everything: the research, the pattern, Driscoll, the paint sample. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Petty officer, I know about the program." I stared at him. I didn't know what he meant. He continued. "There is a program, unauthorized, off the books. It goes back to the Cold War, psychological warfare testing. They were running experiments on isolated crews to study the effects of stress, paranoia, suggestion. The buoys were part of it. The names were planted. The deaths were unintended consequences, but when they started happening, the program was buried. Except some of the people who ran it kept going, for reasons of their own." I asked him who they were. The captain shook his head. "I don't know, but I know that if your name is on a buoy, they've already marked you, and there's only one way to get them to stop. You have to find the painter, you have to look him in the eye, and you have to make sure he knows that you know." I stood there, my mind reeling. 20 years of unexplained deaths, and it all traced back to a government experiment that had gone rogue. And the captain knew. He had known all along. He had filed his reports not to get answers, but to feed the machine, to mark the next target, to keep the program running. Or maybe he was just as trapped as I was, a cog in something larger that he couldn't control. That was when I realized that the only way out was through. The next buoy on our service schedule was a deep water mark 120 miles offshore, a place so remote that no ship passed within 50 miles of it. It hadn't been touched in 5 years. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that if I was ever going to find the painter, it would be there. Alone in the deep Atlantic, where the ocean keeps its secrets and the dead men keep their silence. The buoy we were scheduled to service was designated for SR-117, a deep water mark at the very edge of our operational range. I had seen it before, years earlier, a lonely sentinel on a featureless sea, a place so remote that even the fish seemed sparse. The captain had signed off on the mission without comment, but I knew he understood the true purpose. I was going to bait a trap. The night before we were due on station, I didn't sleep. I sat in the mess, a chart of the area spread before me, a cup of coffee growing cold at my elbow. I kept turning over what the captain had said. A Cold War program, psychological warfare, experiments on isolated crews. It made a kind of sense. Isolated men under stress, susceptible to suggestion. Paint a name on a buoy, seed a rumor, watch the paranoia spread like a virus. Then when a man falls, blame the sea. The perfect crime. But who was still running it? That was the real question. I went over every name I had collected, every crewman, every officer who had rotated through the affected ships. Most had retired, some had died, a few were still serving in distant billets. None of them could have been in 4 places at once. Unless, of course, there was more than one painter. A network, not a lone figure. That thought sent a chill through me. How many, how deep did this go? At 0600 we arrived on station. The sea was calm, an oily swell under a gray sky. The buoy was visible from a mile out, a speck of red against the endless gray. As we closed, I scanned it through binoculars, looking for any sign of fresh paint. Nothing. The steel was rusted, streaked with gull droppings, the light on top dark and dead. It looked exactly like a buoy that had been abandoned for years. But I knew better. I volunteered for the first boat over. The bosun's mate tried to talk me out of it, but I was insistent. I needed to be the one to touch it, to see it up close, to look for any trace of the person who had painted my name on another buoy 6 months earlier. The captain assigned 2 other deckhands, both armed with nothing but boat knives and portable radios. No sidearms were allowed, standard procedure, but I had slipped a small personal blade into my boot. The rigid-hulled inflatable cut through the swell, the cutter a shrinking gray silhouette behind us. As we approached the buoy, I could hear the mournful clang of its bell, the groan of its massive chain. The thing was enormous up close, 20 feet of steel rising out of the water like the neck of some submerged beast. We secured to its ladder and I was the first up. The deck of the buoy was slick with algae. The solar panel was cracked, the battery housing rusted shut. This buoy had not been touched in years. I circled the structure slowly, running my hand over every inch of steel, looking for any mark. Nothing, no paint, no scratch, no sign of recent human contact. The deckhands watched me from the boat, their faces tense. They knew why I was here. Everyone knew. Then I saw it. On the far side, just above the waterline, a scrape. A long, fresh scrape in the marine growth, as if something had been dragged along the hull, not painted but touched. And beneath it, in the water, a flicker of white. I leaned over the railing. Something was floating in the water, tangled in the chain. A piece of cloth. White fabric, the same color as the paint. I reached down with a boat hook and snagged it, pulling it up. It was a rag, an ordinary cotton rag soaked in white marine paint, still wet. That meant he was here. The painter. Within the last few hours, he had stood on this buoy, paint rag in hand, and for some reason he had not painted my name, or he had painted something else. I heard the bosun's mate call over the radio, asking for a status update. I was about to respond when I noticed something else. A small object wedged in a seam on the buoy's deck. A camera, tiny, dark-lensed, fixed to the steel with a magnetic mount. It was pointing directly at me. I froze. I was being watched. Not by a ghost, not by a curse. By a man who used cameras to track his targets, who knew when each buoy was due for service, who could access the fleet's schedule, who had a boat and paint and decades of practice. I reached for the camera, but before I could touch it, I heard a sound. A low hum growing louder. An engine. I looked up and saw it. A small boat, gray, unmarked, no running lights, cutting through the swell from the direction of the open sea. There was one man aboard. He was coming straight for the buoy. I shouted down to the deckhands, told them to get on the radio and call the cutter. Then I climbed down the ladder as fast as I could, my heart hammering. The boat was close now, close enough that I could see the man's face. He was old, 60s maybe, with white hair and a weathered face that had spent decades under the sun. He wore a plain gray jacket, no insignia, no rank, and he was smiling. He cut his engine as he drifted alongside the buoy. He didn't look at the deckhand, he looked at me. And he said in a calm, conversational voice that carried over the water, "You must be Anthony. I've been expecting you." I don't know what I expected. A ghost, a phantom, a monster. Not a man. Not a man who knew my name. I asked him who he was. He didn't answer. He just tossed a line around the buoy's ladder and climbed up with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Up on the deck, he stood a few feet away from me, the Atlantic stretching to infinity on all sides. He told me that the program had been his life's work. He was one of the original researchers, a civilian contractor recruited in the 1960s to study isolation psychology. But when the program was shut down, he had continued. Alone, for decades, using his knowledge of the fleet to move from coast to coast, painting names, watching the results, taking notes. He had no family, no home, no life beyond the buoys. He was a ghost of a man, living on a stolen boat, surviving on the grid's margins. I asked him why. Why kill innocent men one after another for no reason? He looked at me with something that might have been sadness. "I don't kill anyone," he said. "I just paint the names, the sea does the rest. I've never touched a single one of them, I just give them a sign, and what they do with it, that's their choice. Some go mad, some kill themselves, some just disappear, but I never force a hand." I told him he was insane. He nodded as if he had heard it many times before. Perhaps. But I've been doing this for 53 years. The fleet knows. The investigation services know. Deep down, they understand that this is something they can't control, so they look away. They call it getting your buoy and they move on, because confronting me would mean confronting the truth about their own failures. The cutter was on the radio demanding a report. I ignored it. I asked him the question I had been carrying since the day my name appeared. Why me? He tilted his head. Because you asked questions. The ones who ask questions always get marked. It's the only rule I have left, and you asked too many. He reached into his jacket and my hand went to my knife. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon, it was a photograph. A photograph of me taken from a distance standing on the deck of the cutter. In the background, that same buoy where my name had been painted. He had been watching me for months. He told me that my name had been the last. He was tired. His boat was failing. His body was failing. He had come to the buoy that day not to paint, but to retrieve his camera and return to shore for the final time. He had chosen this place because it was isolated, because he knew I would come. He wanted to meet me. He wanted someone to know, because he was dying. A cancer that had spread through his lungs from years of breathing paint fumes and salt air. He had months, perhaps weeks. He had no intention of dying in a hospital. He planned to sail out into the deep Atlantic and never come back. And before he went, he wanted to confess. I stood there on that buoy, 120 miles from land, listening to a man admit to 53 years of murder by proxy. I should have been furious. I should have tried to kill him with my bare hands. But all I felt was a hollow, exhausted numbness. He asked me if I wanted to know how many names. I said no. He told me anyway. 117. One for nearly every buoy he had painted. Most of them had not been on tenders. Some were fishermen, sailors, researchers, anyone who had crossed his path and asked the wrong question. The tender crews were just the ones I had found because I was looking. He said something then that I will never forget. The ocean is very old and very patient. It has its own justice. I am just a man who paints. The sea does the rest, and the sea never tells its secrets. He turned away from me and climbed back down to his boat. The deckhands were shouting, the radio was crackling, but I didn't move. I watched him start his engine and pull away, heading east into the empty ocean. I could have called the cutter, directed them to intercept, but I didn't, because some part of me knew that the justice he spoke of was already coming for him. I never saw him again. I finished my tour 3 months later. On my last servicing run, I checked every buoy hull myself before the crane picked it up. I checked for paint, for cameras, for any sign that the painter had been there. I found nothing. He was gone, truly gone, swallowed by the sea or by his disease or by both. But I kept checking. For the rest of my Coast Guard career, every buoy I serviced, I checked. It became a ritual, a superstition, a way of keeping the fear at bay. And in all those years, I never found another name. What I did find was silence. A wall of silence from the senior officers, from the investigation services, from the fleet. Nobody wanted to talk about Marcus Webb or the painter or the 117 names. The reports I had filed disappeared. The paint sample I had saved went missing from my locker. The captain who had told me about the program was transferred to a desk job in Washington, and a year later he took early retirement. I called him once after I got out. He didn't answer. The sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and the wind is blowing from the east, I think about the painter. I think about his smile, his calm voice, his 1,000-yard stare. And I wonder if he really did die out there, or if he's still painting. Somewhere, on some remote buoy that hasn't been serviced in years, a name appears in fresh white paint. And somewhere else, a man looks over his shoulder, feeling the cold breath of the Atlantic on his neck, and wonders if today is the day the sea will take him. I left the Coast Guard after 12 years. The official reason was family, the need to be on land, a career change. The real reason was that I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. Every time a buoy came over the rail, my heart would stop. Every night transit, I'd scan the dark water, half expecting to see a gray boat with no lights and an old man at the helm, still smiling, still painting. The sea had given me a gift I never asked for, the knowledge that some secrets are too heavy for any one man to carry, and that the only way to survive them is to walk away. But I never stopped checking. Even now, years later, when I drive down to the harbor and watch the boats come in, I look at the steel hulls and wonder. I wonder how many names have appeared since I left the fleet. I wonder if the painter's boat finally sank in a storm, or if it's still out there, drifting on the currents, a ghost ship with a dying captain and a bucket of white paint. I wonder if one day, a young seaman on a tender I once served on will haul up a buoy and find a name he recognizes. And I wonder if anyone will believe him. What I learned out there, 60 miles from land, is that the ocean doesn't care about your paperwork, your incident reports, your chain of command. It has its own order, its own logic, its own justice. And the men who live on it long enough learn to respect that. They learn that some things are not meant to be solved, only survived. They call it getting your buoy and they move on. Not because they don't care, but because caring too much is exactly what gets you marked. There are thousands of navigation buoys off the coasts of this country, blinking their lights through the night, guiding ships safely home. And I know with absolute certainty that some of them have names on their hulls that don't appear on any chart. Maybe you've passed one in a ferry, glanced at a red steel structure rising from the waves, and thought nothing of it. But if you looked closely, if you got close enough to see the paint, you might find something that shouldn't be there. And if you do, I have one piece of advice: don't ask questions. Don't tell anyone, just look away and pray that the name isn't yours. If you've served on a buoy tender or worked offshore and you have a story you can't explain, leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to see more stories from the edge of the world, hit subscribe. The sea is full of voices. Some of them are still speaking.